Found an interesting article from The Hill today. It's called Share of 40-Year-Old Americans Who Have Never Been Married Hits Record High. The share of 40-year-old Americans who have never been married reached a record high in 2021, according to the Pew Research Center. 25% of 40-year-olds remained unmarried in 2021, up from 20% just over a decade earlier in 2010. Pew's analysis of U.S. Census Bureau data found the share of unmarried 40-year-olds has steadily been increasing since 1980, when just 6% of the age group had never been married. Men were slightly more likely than women to remain unmarried into their 40s in 2021. There's a shock, with 28% of men and 22% of women falling into this category, the Pew analysis found. The portion of unmarried 40-year-olds who have also varied across racial and ethnic lines. A larger share of black 40-year-olds had never been married compared to their white, Hispanic, or Asian counterparts. While 46% of black Americans were unmarried at that age, that's literally almost half of us, 27% of Hispanic Americans, 20% of white Americans, and 17% of Asian Americans were in the same position. The portion of 40-year-old Americans who have never been married also decreased as education level rose. 33% of 40-year-olds with a high school education or less remained unmarried, compared to 26% of those with some college education and 18% of those with a bachelor's degree or greater. The Pew analysis noted that many unmarried 40-year-olds in previous decades ultimately married later in life. About a quarter of this age group who had never been married in 2001 were married by 60 years old. Jesus, imagine having to wait that long to get married for the first time. So, this article is much better than what was that stupid thing called? Most young men are single, most young women are not, because it doesn't have any weird supposed experts talking about how men don't have enough to give and there's something wrong with us and all this other, feminist garbage. But I guess with the article, there's a couple of just analysis I could make of it, where they talk about how there's been a steady increase in the number of men, of people who've never been married by 40 since 1980. I guess I don't know what I could really attribute that to. I do think that beginning in the 90s, but I guess starting with some earlier roots in the 70s and 80s, there kind of was this revolution of people being more open about certain things. Like I said before, I have yet to meet a single person I know in real life who's had a kid in the last 10 years that was married. So there really is this thing in American society where previous traditions and standards for what would be considered customary actions you would take as you progress in your age are just kind of not really seen as that big of a deal anymore, which I do think is a mistake in a lot of the situations. But regardless of that, the part that I'm most interested in, and I want to just repeat this, 25% of 40-year-olds remained unmarried in 2021, up from 20% just over a decade earlier. So in a 10-year period that, by the way, saw the advent of social media, because 2010 social media was there, but it still wasn't as prevalent as it is now. In a 10-year period that saw a boom in these different social media sites, whether you're talking about Instagram, Twitter, any of the rest of the pieces of crap, noticeably in that same period, there was a 5% increase in the number of 40-year-olds who have never been married. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I really don't. I believe by a combination of, I explained this before, if you're a man and you have to deal with a lot of the modern women, which are like poison at this point, many of whom enjoy wasting a man's time, leading him on, just stuff that doesn't go anywhere and you can't progress to any semblance of an actual romantic relationship with them, let alone getting married. And then you have a lot of these women who have these like weird flings with different guys, and a lot of it is not really committed in any degree. It makes sense that between men who oftentimes don't get what they want with regard to their romantic interest in some women or woman or whatever, and then a bunch of women who kind of like get off on just playing with and wasting men's time, but never really progressing anything in a serious manner. I'm not surprised at all that the amount has increased. In fact, I'm actually more shocked it hasn't increased even more. Just 5% in 10 years. Well, I guess we'll see what the 2020s bring. And I've already had dire predictions about this decade. The saddest part of the article to me though is where they talk about how 46% of black Americans over the age of 40 were unmarried. And this is a 19% lead over Hispanic Americans, a 26% lead over white Americans, and a 29% lead over Asian Americans. So I just want you to think about this. If you're African American and you're a guy, and like let's say you want to get married, and we already talked about like I think I'm not even trying to do like the race thing. Usually I don't factor it in, but if you want to get married, if we're going by a statistic, there is a almost 30% higher chance that by the time you are 40 or over, you will not be married than there is for an Asian person. And that's really scary because there's something to be said about like trends, you know, you can look at them and go, okay, everybody is affected by this, right? But when you look at this particular part of the statistics, when they break it down along racial lines, it's not the same as this other stuff. Like even when they're talking about more men, you know, being unmarried than women, right? It's 28% to 22%. That still is in like a single digit category, 6 digits, or rather 6% over. With regard to racial lines, the idea that your ethnicity gives you an almost 30% increased disadvantage of getting married over somebody else who happens to be Asian is really disturbing. And I've said before that the problem that often comes into place with a lot of these romance gurus and, you know, geniuses, as they would like to get you to believe that they are, is they never factor in race when it comes to this stuff. So you might have some black person who wants to get married. They don't really care what their partner's ethnicity is. And you might have some Hispanics, some whites, some Asians, all these other groups who also have people in them that want to get married. But unfortunately, a lot of those Hispanics, whites, or Asians will say to the black person, hey, you know, maybe I like speaking to you. Maybe I enjoy being in your presence as a friend. But as far as getting married, dating you, let alone getting married to you, you're just not good enough. And like I said, I've explained this before. I think people should have the right to like whatever they like, but I'm just simply stating that by virtue of being in a group that has this big lead over these other groups when it comes to unmarried people, blacks are at an inherent disadvantage. And I've talked before about how like, well, I already said you can go watch my Unpopular Color, but it's just me pointing out that even when I try to make this about, you know, gender-based stuff where women have a lot of advantages over men, and I hold on to that. I believe that. We just showed in this article that there's a 6% higher chance that by the time you're 40 and you're a man, you're not going to be married ever. But there's something even scarier when you consider that your ethnicity and your gender together puts you in a higher risk of just not meeting someone that you can at least lie to yourself about spending the rest of your life with. Because we've talked before about how a lot of marriages that get divorced end in like the first 5 years. But you can't even have you can't even have the mirage or the fake idea of being with someone forever. And part of that is impacted by your ethnicity. As unfortunate as it is for me to admit that, that's what this article is saying. So I think the numbers are going to keep getting bigger. I think that marriage is something that I wanted at various points, but the way women in the modern era are, I don't think I'll get it. And I think I'll be among a larger and larger group of people who don't receive it.